And we're there.
Excellent. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes to make sure everybody's here. So please enjoy the pictures. That should appear shortly, and I will speak to you in a couple of minutes. Okay, so I have been asked for a sound check, so hopefully everything is working and we will start shortly.
I can hear you perfectly.
Wonderful. And that was not supposed to happen. That's my next slide. Cool. I think I will make a start. So welcome back, everyone. It's been great to hear what people have been saying about the event. I'm actually physically in Southampton, and it's been great chatting to all the attendees, and everyone's been having a great time. I shared a few pictures that I thought people might enjoy seeing. So some stats as well. So we had 246 people in person across our 9 venues. We definitely had a group online as well. I don't know exactly how many. Anita's keynote had 100 online views, and Tim's keynote also had 100. So there's probably some double counting in there, but I think we can, reasonably say we've got about 300 people, which is fantastic for this event. We also streamed 30 of the talks. So I think that went really well. We had a few bumps at the beginning, so apologies for that, but I think we've ironed out most of the kinks now. We've got some online recordings as well, so we'll put them on the website in due course. So I will now introduce Regina, our keynote for this afternoon. So Regina, if you want to put your slides up as well. So Regina Obe is a core contributor and project steering committee member of PostGIS, GEOS and PG routing projects. And at OSGeo UK, we've supported her through a patronship of $60 per month since April 2018. So supporting PostGIS maintenance and development. And as a part of that, she builds the PostGIS bundle packages for Windows, including Postgres SQL, spatial extensions, so PostGIS, PG routing, PG Point Cloud, and OGR FDW. She also manages the PostGIS source releases and does a lot of PostGIS bug fixing. She's also president of Paragon Corporation, a Postgres SQL and PostGIS consulting company. So exactly as we did before, Please post your questions as we go through Regina's talk. Please post them on the online YouTube chat or in the matrix room, and I'll collate them and ask her those at the end. So I will hand over to Regina.
Thanks, Nick. Can everybody see my screen and hear my voice?
Yep.
Okay. So in addition to all those things Nick said, I'm also an author of several books. And these are listed here in reverse chronological order of when they were published. And I'm working on 2 new books. One is Book of PostgreSQL, and the other is the 2nd edition of PG Routing, which should cover PG Routing 3 and 4. And I forgot to mention, there's also a coupon for Locate Press, PostGIS Day 2022, which you can use at the checkout to buy any Locate Press books, including all the QGIS books that Locate Press publishes. Today, this time is a very special time of the year. It's the time after GIS, or more specifically, PostGIS Day. It's also how some people pronounce a piece of software that's very dear to my heart. Before I started using PostGIS, I worked in the city of Boston government, and right next to me was this giant printing device called a plotter. And this plotter was like a fence that separated me from my next door neighbors. My next door neighbors were people in the planning, research, and mapping unit, and they would use this plotter to create maps that looked something like this. And when I saw what they were doing, I decided I wanted to print my maps so that I could finally fit my huge maps on a big piece of paper. And so I printed these. And one of my neighbors was a man named Larry Brayman. And unfortunately, he passed away fairly recently in the past year. And he would print his maps on the plotter, throw them on his lap, stroll over to my maps, and admire them and ask me questions about them. And from then on, Larry would teach me much of what I knew about GIS at the time, and I would teach him about databases and database management and programming. One day, Larry came to me and he wanted to do something. He wanted people to be able to interact with the maps he was developing. And he was trying to use this piece of software called ArcIMS, and he wasn't getting too far with it. So since I knew a little bit about web programming and programming in general, I offered to help him out. And after looking at ArcIMS, I decided it was much too complicated for what he was trying to do. And in my mind, what we needed was something that could just read the files that he had, which were in map info format, display them on a web page, and with image map clicks, allow users to interact with it. And so my search began for this piece of software that would do just that. And so this is how I discovered Map Server. So Map Server at the time was called UMN Map Server because it was incubated at the University of Minnesota. And Map Server did everything I expected such software to do. It essentially just got out of my way. It could load the files that Larry was generating with MapInfo. It used HTML templates and a simple text file that defined all the layers, the GIS layers you wanted to use. And so I joined the Map Server mailing list because I wanted to use this software. The only problem was I didn't know how to compile it at the time, and I was on Windows. So I learned from the Map Server mailing list the easiest way to compile code that was designed for a Unix system such as Map Server was to use a system called Cygwin, which would generate Windows dynamic libraries. Also on that mailing list, I learned about a new project called PostGIS. And what was special about PostGIS is that it could understand SQL. And how it did that, it needed to be hoisted, so to speak, into a database called PostgreSQL. I didn't know anything about PostgreSQL at the time because I was mostly a SQL Server MS Access user. But the fact that PostgreSQL had SQL in its name, I just assumed I already needed to know all I needed to know about it. So my journey to using PostGIS started, except I had to learn how to compile it. And once I did, I was able to use my SIGWIN skills to compile Postgres and PostGIS. And I was able to load many layers that we had. But one layer, perhaps the most important layer for Larry's work, was the Boston neighborhoods layer. And this was a layer that PostGIS just couldn't understand. And I really badly wanted to use it because I saw potential in this. So I wrote my first bug report, which essentially said, PostGIS doesn't like my data. Here's my data. What's wrong with it? And I was expecting to not hear back or laughed at for my ignorance. Instead, I received a personal thank you within minutes from Paul Ramsey and a code patch shortly after with some sort of explanation I couldn't remember. I have known Paul since then. Some things never change. We were born in the same year, 1971, and thus our ages remain essentially the same. And by extension, many of our experiences, at least of IT, are similar. The physical distance between us is still the same, but the biggest change is that he can now pronounce my name correctly instead of as a British Canadian. So my route to PostGIS started in Boston. I made a stop to the University of Minnesota where I chatted with the natives, and so those suggested I go to British Columbia, Victoria, where PostGIS was born. But that's just an illusion. My real trip looked more like this. Building on things that I already understood: search, email, CGI, HTML, JavaScript, and geometry I learned from elementary and high school, and the SQL Server I'd already picked up, and to add to that, SIGWIN and Map Server and Postgres. And through that journey, I made several stops, many of them that made me feel isolated. But I persevered, and I was able to get to my destination. So if we revisit my trip, why did I choose to go down the Map Server PostGIS route instead of ArcIMS, which is what everyone was telling me to use? The reason was, when I looked at ArcIMS, it had many layers I didn't understand. It didn't seem to interact with the standard tools I was used to using and wanted to introduce all sorts of extra tools. Whereas Map Server and PostGIS built on things I already understood. They use standards like CGI, the Common Gateway, to interact with web servers. The SQL Server, the SQL to interact with the database. And then once I got into it, I realized that PostGIS was just geometry overlaid on SQL. And so standards are important, and SQL is a very old standard that dates back to the 70s. And from then it was built. There was a language that never came to fruition called DSL Alpha, which was kind of the template for SQL and the PostQuel that Ingrace and Postgres used. And those eventually transformed into what we know today as SQL. It's pronounced SQL, which was kind of its original name, but the name was changed to SQL because of trademark issues. And spatial features for SQL built on top of SQL. And then later on came the SQL standard, which became part of the SQL standard. And so I started my map server and PostGIS journey before OSGeo became a thing. All these projects were all separate projects. Map server, Proj and Grass came early. They came in the 80s. They predate Linux. And so they were all Unix-based. And map server, similarly, all spun off from the US government projects. And GDAL came a little bit later as a way to support numerous spatial formats that are around. And map server was the first web application that understood PostGIS data. And so one of the first drivers, I think, that was native to it was the PostGIS driver. And finally, shortly after came QGIS, which allowed, I think it was the first desktop tool to allow visualization of PostGIS. And then others came after. And so together, all these projects came together and formed what we know as Open Geospatial Foundation, OSGeo. So aside from the fact that PostGIS allowed me to use all the skills I already had, there was another reason I was drawn to it, and it's more of a sentimental reason. I've always struggled with finding my way in reading maps about physical locations. Every place just looks the same to me. I blame that on forced right-handedness in childhood, that I feel scrambled my intuitive sense of physical space. As a young girl of 10, my favorite devices were my graph paper and my computer that I called Vic. I'd write programs on Vic to teach my sister Vicky, which is short for Victoria, the birthplace of PostGIS, basic math. One program I did would randomly pick two numbers and draw the number of sticks on it. If Vicky answered the question right, it would launch a rocket ship. And all this I started off with a blank piece of graph paper, and I plotted the course. And then I used Vic to make it live. So space to me has always represented where you put things and not necessarily where they physically are. When I first started using PostGIS, I recognized it as an old friend in a new form. It reduced the world into terms I was familiar with, a reshaping of space to simplify the understanding of it, an ability to put things where you want or need them to be, rather than accepting them where they are. So there are two guiding tenets that drive most of my decisions. The first is the present is controlled by the majority, but the future is shaped by the minority. And so I'm going to take a slight detour to fossils. So most people here have probably heard of Git and GitHub, but fewer have heard of Fossil. And Fossil is another distributed version control system. And it's perhaps better for most people's use cases than Git. But it's not, Git is used more frequently. And part of that reason is because the network inertia around Git is much larger. So what makes people choose a FOSS product? As FOSS developers, we'd like to think people are flocking to use our software because they find the idea of a tool that can change liberating, or that it is better than anything else they have ever tried. But a large percentage of the users are driven by network inertia. And what comes second is that your software is free and it's good enough. And only after all that do they ever pick it, or they discover that it is liberating. And although that's kind of a sad view, if you turn this list on its head, you see another pattern. You see a more promising pattern. The very first supporters, including the founder of the software, are coming because they find it liberating, or the alternatives just don't work for them. And as more people come on board, the software becomes better, absolutely better than the other offerings. And so it begins to garner some inertia. And then more people will come because it's free and it's better. So of course you choose it. And so it's because of your early people, the minority, that you gain a majority of your network inertia, or at least the beginning of it, that causes a spark. And so as I walk through this vast landscape, I feel less alone with my choice of PostGIS and Postgres, because there's a lot of infrastructure that is built around it. You now have QGIS, you now have numerous commercial offerings that support it. You have it in the cloud. So it's clear that both PostGIS and QGIS, and by extension OSGeo, have cemented their place. But I'm also humbled by the fact that lots of users who I think PostGIS and QGIS would be a better tool for their job are still restricted by closed-minded overlords. And so we still have much work to do in terms of making these tools easy and marketing them so that people who it's a better tool for are more aware. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Regina. That was a really interesting presentation, and lots of things to think about there. So we have some time for questions. So any questions, please do type them in the YouTube chat or the matrix room, and I'll pass them on to Regina. A comment to kick off. Tyler Mitchell of Locate Press mentioned in YouTube, he says the map server was also his gateway to all sorts of open source goodness. So I think that reminded him of some of his kind of early experiences. And I find it fascinating why people use open source, because, you know, in your kind of description, you're very much it's because it's open, and that contrasts quite a lot with Tim Sutton from our keynote earlier was saying a little bit about it's free and it's a pragmatic solution. So you know, I'd like to think there's room for both in our community. I think there probably is. Do you want to add anything onto that? You're muted, Regina.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll answer Tyler's question. He said, what inspired me to write the first PostGIS book, and what made me think anyone would read it? Cool. Well, I guess the first reason is writing makes you actually understand your technology, and it forces you to look at pieces of it that you wouldn't normally look at. So even if no one would read it, I didn't really care that much because I still gained something from it. And the other reason is I just wanted to get the word out. So if there's a chance that anyone would read it, I figured it would increase the network inertia of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's a really good comment, and it reminds me that Cartoza have recently announced that they're funding a document contribution for QGIS full time for a year. So the documentation is key, you know. And as a trainer, an educator, I do a lot of writing of materials, and it really makes you think about, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing, and how do I do that? Cool. So we've had some great comments. People really enjoyed Regina's talk. Very, very honest and thought-provoking. Great bit of history too. Yeah, I don't think we have any questions, at least none that I can see. So we'll leave it open for a little bit. If there are any questions in the room, please do pass them through. Cool. So maybe, oh yeah, we've got a question. So if open source has a potential weakness, it might be dependent on specific individuals. You know, we've seen this a couple of times. How successfully does PostGIS mitigate against this issue? It's from Tom.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I don't think there is a way. The best you can do is try to attract more people. So, for example, I think there's also a sense that when someone leaves, someone takes over. So if you look at, for example, the GDAL project, Frank left, Evan stood up. In my case, there was a man named Mark Cave Ayland, and he was the one that produced the Windows builds. And when he left, I took over. So I think it's part of it. You can't really prepare for it, but people have a sense in them that someone has to do this. So someone stands up to do it if they care enough about the project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think Tom's feelings are similar, because he says sad face in the YouTube chat. So I think, yeah, so it's a common issue, most definitely. Wonderful. I don't think there are any more questions. We've got a couple of minutes. So is there anything else you'd like to add, or anything you'd like to? Oh, yeah, we just had a question. Apologies. So from Diageo, do you see any change in PostGIS essence when the three main cloud providers are offering it as a SaaS, software as a service?
That's another really good question. I actually get funding from Amazon for releases. So even though people think that SaaS is bad sometimes for open source, I think it can be a cooperative relationship, because on the one hand, you have governments who need to sue somebody. And so the SaaS kind of provides the suit. I can sue Amazon, right? Which has always been an issue, because Oracle, you can sue them. PostGIS, you can't really sue because we said we're not liable. So I think from the perspective of giving that comfort level to bigger organizations, it actually helps open source.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to know that you get funding from Amazon for your work with this. And I think that's something that sometimes we're not very good at communicating as a open source community, that, you know, there are quite a lot of big players involved, and, you know, Amazon probably don't shout about it enough, but maybe we need to shout about it a bit more. Ian Turnton says his biggest scare was when they had 15 QGIS developers on the same bus from Brighton to Nottingham. Presumably that was for the FOSS4G conference in the UK. Hopefully nothing untoward happened. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Regina. That's been a really interesting presentation. Lots of things to think about there. So thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Cool. So we're going to swap over more or less straight away to my wrap-up session, which I will promise to keep very short. So Amy, if you could do the Jitsi magic.
Sure.